Paul Sparrow is the co-host. No, you're just the host. You're the host of the Fireside Chats.
Hostess with the mostest.
He is. He is a writer, historical consultant, and the former director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. Before moving to the FDR Library, he was the deputy director and senior vice president at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. He is the author of the book Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh, and the Battle to Save Democracy. Fred Dylla has 3 degrees in physics from MIT because he's an overachiever and spent yeah, they're like, Fred, and spent 15 years as a research scientist at the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, followed by 16 years as the chief technical officer at the Department of Energy's Jefferson Lab in Newport News, Virginia. He finished his formal paid career as the executive director of the American Institute of Physics in College Park, Maryland. He now spends his time creating and teaching the art of woodcut prints, which
here at the library.
I was going to say, which he does here at the library, as well as writing and lecturing about the history of science and art. And he also is the co-organizer and co-moderator of the library's online Science and Society series, which the spring series just so happens to start this Tuesday with a presentation on the science breakthroughs of 2025 by Science's news editor, Tim Appenzeller. You can register for that through our website. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you two gentlemen.
Thank you. A round of applause for Rebecca. And for all of the library staff, they did an amazing job last night with the Jamie Raskin event at the library, at the high school. They do so many programs here. They really deserve our support. All right, so we're going to get started tonight. I'm honored to be joined by Fred. He's the smart one. I'm the good-looking one.
I thought it was the other way around.
So polio has been a dreaded disease throughout human history. This is actually an image of an Egyptian priest with a withered leg, common to polio survivors. This dates back to 1500 BC. So polio has been present as long as humans have been keeping records. These are drawings of beggars and vagrants suffering from the effects of polio. This is either by Bosch or Bruegel. Wasn't able to get a definitive artist for this, but it really was one of those diseases that has throughout history terrorized humans because the people who catch it are walking around and you see the horrors of the after effects.
I don't know if you can see that. It's probably not big enough, but everyone is hobbling or crippled. They're pretty terrible if you focus on any one of those individuals.
So this is Dr. Michael Underwood. So in 1789, he was the first person to describe polio as a specific disease, what he called a disability of the lower extremities. But
he was a very interesting fellow, Dr. Underwood. He probably should be described as the first Dr. Spock.
Not the Star Trek.
Not the Star Trek. The one who wrote the baby book, because he was the first medical doctor in the Western world to focus on diseases and treatments for infants. And he wrote Dr. Spock's book. It was called A Treatise on the Diseases of Children, published in 1784. And it had the byline with general directions for the management of infants from birth. This was not a topic that medicine was focused on in the 17th and 18th century. And like our own Dr. Spock, he wrote the book not only for the medical professionals of London, but it was also written in language that the educated public could understand.
Okay, this is you.
Oh, and so how did vaccines get to the Western world? We can thank another Londoner. This is a wonderful title, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was at Pierpoint before she was married to Lord Montagu. And part of Lord Montagu's job was the ambassador to Turkey. And Lady Montagu sent quite a few letters back from Turkey to London. And while she was in Turkey, she realized that they knew how to cure people from smallpox, which was one of the scourges of the Middle Ages. And in Turkey, they took a little bit of the disease from a person with smallpox and put that on a person who did not have smallpox, as you can see in that drawing there from the Istanbul Library. Doesn't sound like a pleasant thing to do. If you look at the fellow on the right, he's covered with spots, and the fellow on the left getting the treatment has none. So it must have been a little trepidatious. But it worked. It basically prevented people from getting serious cases of smallpox. And she is credited for bringing the science of inoculation to the Western world. Now, fortunately for us, we knew about that in the middle of the revolution. Many of you probably had a chance to see Mr. Burns' Revolution series on PBS. Marvelous. And the drawing on the bottom right is actually a painting of Continental troops being inoculated while they spent the horrible winter of 1777 in Morristown, New Jersey. And the letter, which you can't read, was one of many letters that General Washington wrote to his officers saying, "Thou shalt inoculate the troops." And prior to inoculation, most soldiers died from pestilence and disease like smallpox rather than the war itself. So how did the science of vaccines develop after these first inklings from Lady Montagu? There was another wonderful English doctor by name of Edward Jenner. And he noticed that a dairymaid had a form of smallpox, it was called cowpox, that she got from milking cows. And it was much milder than the smallpox blisters that would occur on humans. And so Jenner realized that if he used a little bit of the cowpox as the vaccinating element, the vaccine would be less deleterious and the recovery better. So Mr. Jenner is credited with starting the science of vaccines.
But right from the very beginning, of course, if you have a vaccine, you have vaccine skeptics.
So here's a wonderful drawing. Dr. Jenner and his associates are on the right. You see he's holding up a sword, and he's welding off vaccine skeptics, which are going after him. And if you have a good eye, you can see that there are dead bodies littered on the floor of this painting. So vaccine hesitancy, which we'll talk about near the end of the talk, has a long history. So here's a quote from a young medical student from University of Maryland Health Science Center. I just want to read to you because I think it's very good. It says, although the history of vaccination has been but the history of its uniform and ascendant progress over all obstacles, whether of ignorance, prejudice, or avarice, still there has always been those who, unwilling or unable to survey the whole subject, have preferred to rely on their own limited experience of a few doubtful cases and reject the boon of Jenner, that's Dr. Jenner, rather than assert to a mass of evidence such as has rarely, if ever, been accumulated in any other department of human investigation. Now that's a modern quote from 221 from a young medical student.
So the vaccines were one of those things that tracked the most terrifying diseases. And of course, smallpox was terrifying, polio was, but it's not the only one that was terrifying.
So here's a photo of New York City in 1872, case smallpox vaccine was available then. And here we are vaccinating the poor in New York City back in 1872. Remember that thought as we go on. So as Paul mentioned, smallpox was not the only scourge that we were worried about dying from. And we're going to be talking about mainly this evening Roosevelt's cases of polio, his case of polio, and what he was able to do to enable the cure that we now all enjoy. But it turns out he wasn't the only Roosevelt to launch a major public health campaign. And I want to introduce you to a Delaware angle to our story today. So a Delaware activist, a woman by the name of Emily Bissell, she was a Wilmington lady, and she was very active in trying to help a sanatorium for TB survive in Wilmington. Now, TB was a scourge until we realized that it was a bacteria and that we could deal with it with antibiotics. But back then, we had no such cures. And so people were basically put in sanatoriums and tried to make comfortable. Well, there was a Wilmington sanatorium that was about to go bust, and Emily Bissell was not going to have that. And so she designed a stamp, and she started selling the stamps all over Delaware. And the stamps were called Christmas seals. She was somewhat of an artist. She made that first Christmas seal stamp. And there was an article written about it in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Teddy Roosevelt read the article. And Teddy made, I don't know if he made any contributions from his wealth, but he publicized the event. And it was basically the launch of the Christmas Seal campaign, which has gone on to not only deal with tuberculosis, but all respiratory diseases. The organization that now is the benefactor is the American Lung Association.
So the first documented outbreak of polio in the United States happened in 1894 in Vermont. Only a couple dozen people were infested. And the first major outbreak occurred in 1916, causing 6,000 deaths and more than 21,000 survivors, victims. This was one of those shocking developments because polio had not really been widespread. It had been fairly rare. And there was very little you could do for polio survivors. This is a boy who caught it in 1916. They didn't have any treatments for it, really. They didn't really understand where it came from. And it did predominantly strike children, which made it even more terrifying for adults, fearful that their children were going to catch this and then be crippled for the rest of their lives. One of the most terrifying things is that it causes paralysis in your limbs, but it can also cause paralysis of your lungs and of your chest. And children who were afflicted with their respiratory system had to essentially live in these, what they call iron lungs. And some of them would recover enough where they could come out, and some of them were trapped in these iron lungs until they died. So it was a really terrifying disease.
As terrifying as polio was, and part of the reason it was so terrifying that it afflicted mainly children, there were plenty of other diseases to worry about between the beginning of the 20th century toward the end. One of them being typhus. Typhus, through the ages, murdered millions of people, particularly when there was a war, when both soldiers and the civilian populations were in non-clean conditions. Basically, it's caused by a bacteria called rickettsia, and it was spread by lice. And if you can imagine, if you're middle of the war or you're a refugee, there's plenty of rats and plenty of lice around. But how the vaccine was developed is an amazing story, and it's dependent on these two remarkable gentlemen by the name of Rudolf Wigel on the left. He was a Polish doctor, zoologist, and his colleague Ludwig Fleck was also a Polish doctor and biologist. And they figured out how to make a very effective vaccine for typhus. It worked very well. Mr. Wigel actually was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1930, 1934, 1936, and 1939, but unfortunately he never got it. He was more fortunate than his colleague Ludwig Fleck because Fleck was Jewish. Wigel managed to save many Jewish colleagues during the Holocaust in Poland by hiding them. And he was recognized by the State of Israel in 2003 with their medal called Righteous Among the Nations. Well, Fleck was known by the German occupiers. They knew he was Jewish, but they knew he was brilliant. And so they shipped him and his family first to Auschwitz in 1942. And he didn't get what most occupiers of the camp got because they knew he could be valuable. And so he was told to develop serums to treat not only the staff, but some of the inmates of the camp, probably the people they used for forced labor. That was in 1942. 1943, he was sent to Buchenwald, and that's where he stayed and managed to stay alive through the end of the war in April of 1945. And he managed to stay alive by producing the typhus vaccine for not only the staff of Buchenwald, but some of the inmates. And he treated the staff with a fake vaccine that didn't work. These two people should be enshrined for what they did in World War II. Now, the Spanish flu was just a bad excursion. Of course, many of you probably have relatives that dealt with the great epidemic in 1916 to 1918. It was probably the deadliest epidemic in history. I mean, records worldwide were not that good. Some estimates are that 20 million people died, some as high as 50 million, and it may have affected half of the world's known population. It was certainly the worst epidemic on record. It broke out in the middle of World War I in France and in Germany and England, because that's where the soldiers were, and that's where they were fighting. Why do we call it the Spanish flu if the epicenter is north of that? Well, that's a great misnomer of history. It turns out that the French press, English press, and the American press did not want to upset soldiers or incoming soldiers by letting them know that there was a very bad flu epidemic if they were going to be on the front lines or anywhere near them. The only press that was not suppressed was Spain, because it was a neutral country. So the flu was given that name, the Spanish flu, from then on. It was caused by one of the first flu viruses that was ever typed. influenza A. Before we got modern vaccines, you couldn't do much, but learning how to deal with influenza became one of the first successes of modern medicine that we still enjoy today because we sign up or should sign up for a seasonal flu vaccine. And some of you may say, well, it doesn't work all the time. But I'll show you some data later. It prevents you from getting very sick or even worse. And the flu virus, which is like the coronavirus, which you've all seen too many pictures of, has these complicated little biological shapes, and it's very hard to predict how to make the best medicine set for that. So we go through this annual routine of the pharmaceutical companies guessing at what the flu virus would be most virulent in what form by the end of the year, and we get the vaccines to deal with that.
My grandfather was a soldier in World War I and died of the Spanish flu. Matter of fact, more American soldiers died of the flu than on the battlefield. And Franklin Roosevelt also got the Spanish flu. So in 1916, he's healthy and happy and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Washington. He goes across to Europe to inspect the troops. On his way back, he's very, very desperately ill. So ill he has to be taken off the boat in a stretcher. And he's so ill that his wife has to unpack his suitcase, and that's where she discovers the love letters of his affair with Lucy Mercer. So, but in 1920, FDR runs for vice president with Warren against Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. And they lose terribly, but he's this rising political star. Everybody thinks he's going to be the next Democratic candidate. And in the summer of 1921, he goes up to the family cottage in Campbell Island in Canada and comes down with polio. This was a sort of a shocking development. It took him a while to figure it out. He got so sick he couldn't move. They thought he was going to die. They had to transport him from, if you've ever been up in that part of Maine, it's fairly remote. And back then it was even more remote. And word had spread that he was sick, and the press showed up. And so they had to basically smuggle him out of this house and on a boat and get on a train and come back to New York. And the press is clamoring to know what's going on. And they finally have to admit that he had polio, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. Because, again, it was sort of shocking that he was 38 years old at the time, that a grown man, a healthy man like that, would come down with polio when it so often is contracted by children. You can see here, this is 1924, several years after it. He had sort of taught himself how to pretend to walk using steel leg braces and crutches. This was very common, polio survivors having to use some kind of means to support. And as he got back into the political limelight in 1924, he went to the Democratic Convention. It was the first time he'd been seen in public since he'd contracted polio. And that fall, he was convinced by George Foster Peabody, a well-connected politician and philanthropist who had resurrected Saratoga Springs up in New York as a rehabilitation center, that FDR should buy the Meriwether Inn, which was a rundown resort in the red dirt farm region of Georgia, in a little town called Bullockville, a real attractive name. Its mineral-rich springs fed these warm water pools that were rumored to help polio victims. So FDR went there, and he fell in love with the place. And he felt that it would actually, because you're buoyant in the very salty water, and he was paralyzed from the waist down, it allowed him to actually feel like he could get additional movement in his legs. And as he wrote to his cousin Daisy, I was able to wiggle my big toe today. It was like that level of nuance of any hope that he might someday actually be able to walk. So FDR pours half his fortune into buying Warm Springs, this rundown resort, and turns it into the sort of premier polio rehabilitation center, and then creates something called the Warm Springs Foundation, which was sort of a revolutionary new idea about sort of private funding for medical research to help find a cure for this terrible disease. And this foundation became the central focus of his activities until he runs for governor, and then all of a sudden he's president of the United States. So as president, he loved toga parties. No. He actually used the presidency as a way to help raise funds. So every year on his birthday, January 30th, they would have what they were called the birthday ball. And they would, all across the country, people would have birthday balls and they would raise money, which would go to initially the Warm Springs Foundation to help in the research for polio. And yes, if you look just to his right, you can see Eleanor just having the time of her life. That's his daughter Anna on his left. But these parties were a way to get all Americans an opportunity to sort of find a way to help support this research. In 1936, a very, very famous singer and performer and dancer named Eddie Cantor came up with the idea that we need to come up with something a little snazzier than the Warm Springs Foundation. And at that point, Time magazine had a very popular newsreel showing in movie theaters called The March of Time, and he decided that he was going to start something called the March of Dimes. Okay, now you can open your little envelopes now. So as soon as the word got out that they had, the March of Dimes, tens of thousands of letters flooded the White House. You can see Missy LeHand here holding up a dime, and all the letters in front of her, all the dimes that came to the White House. So it was a brilliant fundraising effort. And one of the things that, as a fundraising effort, we wanted to give you a dime and give you the opportunity at the end of the program to give the dime to the library and any additional loose bills you have in your pocket to show that you support the concept of fundraising and gift giving to community organizations, which are, okay, back to our regularly scheduled program.
You can fold up a check and put it in that
Checks are fine. If you want to just stick your credit card in, we'll take that as well. No dime? Look under your seat. Probably fell out. This is FDR holding $1 million check, which is how much they raised for one year in the birthday ball. And remember, this is during the Great Depression, which is one of the reasons the idea of the March of Dimes was so successful. It meant any American could give children a dime, contribute a dime to help cure polio. And the March of Dimes became very, very successful in funding. And then FDR dies where I can get there. Yeah, we're going to go to.
We'll do a few other scourges before we come back to polio.
We'll come back to polio.
Look, polio was such an emotional disease that we've already mentioned because it affected children for the most part. But here it's affecting our president, our beloved president. And so it got a lot of press. And it didn't mean that there were other diseases that needed to be taken care of. As bad as both world wars were for the population of the world, it caused a tremendous amount of very important research that led to vaccines that now save our lives from diseases we hardly mention. Tetanus being one of them, because from a kid, you step on a nail or scratch yourself, you better have a tetanus shot or you get one immediately. So you can imagine troops in the trenches. It was a scourge of warfare. And a vaccine was available in the early part of World War I, but it wasn't very effective and it was hard to make. They had to take the serum from horses. And luckily by 1924, we made a much more effective vaccine that could be commercialized. And before World War II, we started vaccinating our soldiers and our recruits. And well over 1 million World War II recruits were vaccinated from tetanus, since it basically eliminated the threat of tetanus wounds as a battlefield problem. And it's probably the earliest and best example of routine preventative medicine based on a vaccine, something we still should remember today. Now, in the Pacific, we had yellow fever anywhere where you had a warm, wet climate. So the troops that were in the Pacific theater in Africa and South America, yellow fever was the scourge. Max Tyler, who got the Nobel Prize, there you see him on the left, he worked at the Rockefeller Foundation. He was able to develop a very effective vaccine for yellow fever. First, he tested it on mice, then he tested it on monkeys, and then he tested it on real people. That's the procedure that's used today to develop a safe and effective vaccine. And by the time he was finished, the Rockefeller Foundation paid for 28 million doses of yellow fever vaccines. It basically wiped out this disease worldwide. But it became a model of how vaccines should be developed. And vaccines weren't the only miracle of medicine that got us through World War II. Okay, you have a wound, it's going to be infected. You needed very effective and cheap and available antibiotics, penicillin being the most famous one. But before the war, it was very difficult to get any large quantities. So we can thank this gentleman, Andrew Moyer, who worked for our own Department of Agriculture. And he developed this scheme to scale up and mass produce penicillin. If you've gone to the drugstore recently and picked up penicillin, it costs you less than $1 typically. And this work, the prior preparations to deal with vaccines and antibiotics before World War II were seen as strategic assets, as important as the number of troops and the number of weapons. And it also enabled how we develop medicines and vaccines now by putting in place large-scale clinical trials for their safety. It also put in place the role of the government for funding the basic research and then the initial development of the drug. And NIH became an important asset to this country. So the stage was set for what the rest of our talk is about, for vaccines for polio. And that you want to mention the dime there? You already did, I guess.
When at the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt dies. And so the greatest fundraiser, in the history of the world, they were concerned what was going to happen to the March of Dimes, that without FDR, continuing his campaign and his support, that the research would dry up. And of course, they hadn't found a cure for polio in 1945 when he died. And so they decided that they would put his likeness on the dime. Now, I do this test all the time. It's a little late for you. But I ask people, do you know why Franklin Roosevelt is on the dime? And I would say less than 5% of the people that I've asked that question know why Franklin Roosevelt is on the dime. Now, some of them are younger and don't even know who Roosevelt was. But slight sidetrack here. At a certain point in the 1990s, the Republicans decided they wanted to replace Franklin Roosevelt on the dime with Ronald Reagan. And this became a big movement in Congress. And the person who absolutely squelched it was Nancy Reagan, who said, you cannot remove Franklin Roosevelt from the dime because of him, they cured polio. So that is why Franklin Roosevelt is still on the dime. And again, if you want to put your money in to support the library at the end of this program, we'll be glad checks, credit card, stock, whatever. Okay, so in 1947, Jonas Salk accepted a professorship at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, which was funded by the March of Dimes. So for the next 7 years, he devoted himself to trying to figure out how to cure polio.
So it actually starts with identifying what the polio virus was. And that happened in 1949 at Boston's Children's Hospital. 3 doctors, John Enders, Thomas Weller, Frederick Robbins at Boston Children's Hospital, they were the first to isolate the human virus for polio. And because of that work, they got the 1954 Nobel Prize. Okay? So Jonas Salk started his work, as Paul mentioned, in 1948 on funding from the March of Dimes. He did all his important work on polio vaccines at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And he started that in 1948. By the next year, he had a probable vaccine that he started testing first on animals. And then in 1952, he tested it on himself and then his family. Here's a picture of Jonas on the right with his young son, Peter, who became a doctor, and his wife is on the left, inoculating himself. And by a year later, 1.6 million children in the U.S. and Canada were inoculated. All of that funded by the March of Dimes. And the results of the first test before that mass inoculation were announced on the 12th of April, 1955. The next day, the drug was licensed. We knew how to do things a little quicker at that point. Well, this is an incredible invention. Salk was often asked, so how much money did you make with this incredible invention? It was licensed to 6 pharmaceutical companies, but he believed that the use of that vaccine would not be universal if it didn't come out with 0 cost or next to 0 cost. And he emphasized that point in 1955 when he was interviewed on Edward R. Murrow on TV. You remember that show? And Murrow asked, so who owned the patent for this polio vaccine? And he said, well, the people do. I would say there is no patent. Could you patent the sun? It's a famous quote that he's remembered of. So polio cases in 53, when he started the inoculations, there were 53,000 in the U.S. That's a big number, but it's nothing like some of those other diseases we talked about. It was because of the emotion of seeing children getting this disease and a very famous president. By 57, it was down to 5,000 in the U.S. By 1961, there were 190 people. And basically, the U.S. was declared eradicated of polio by 1994.
So from 1938 through the approval of the Salk vaccine in 1955, the March of Dimes Foundation spent $233 million on polio patient care, which led to more than 80% of U.S. polio patients receiving significant foundation aid. So they weren't just funding research. At the same time, they were also funding the care and treatment of people who had gotten polio. And of course, once the polio vaccine came out, then all of the money they raised was able to go through to education, to create more polios, create more facilities and centers. So now we go to the next step.
Mr. Sabine, so how many of you got the Salk vaccine as a kid? How many got the Sabine sugar cubes? Okay, more. So Sabine was working at the same time. He was also a medical doctor who had a good training in biology. And he developed a vaccine that used a weakened form of the live virus that could be put on drops on a sugar cube. Well, the Salk vaccine had to be given with a needle. Okay, for some people, that's a non-starter to start with. And also, if you remember some of the drugs we still use now that have to be injected, they have to be kept cool. Okay? None of that was a problem with the Sabine vaccine. It could be stored at room temperature. It could be given easily to people on a few drops on sugar cubes. Well, even those were advantages for the Salk vaccine. It was hard to get it going in the U.S. because most of the U.S. population had been inoculated with the Salk vaccine. So he had a hard time getting clinical trials through. He actually had a Russian friend by the name of Mikhail Chumakov, and he convinced this Russian virologist to run clinical trials in Russia. And over 10 million children in 1959 were inoculated with the Sabine oral vaccine. And that information came back to the U.S. through the World Health Organization. And the U.S. said, fine, it works, we'll take their evidence for that. It's actually one of the few successes of Cold War cooperation in the 50s. So we should, if we summarize where we are with polio, there was one other advantage with the Sabine vaccine. It actually interrupted the transmission of polio. If you took the Salk vaccine, it solved polio for that child, but that child could still transmit it to another child. So the Sabine vaccine was actually better because it interrupted that chain and it just stopped polio in its tracks. Okay? By 2003, there were only 6 countries in the world that had polio cases. By 2006, it dropped to 4. And in the early part of 2021, there were only 2 cases of polio that were documented in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that seems to be a result of our very own CIA. The CIA was accused of, instead of vaccinating kids for polio, vaccinating them so they'd be sterile. It was all made up, but it caused a dearth of polio vaccines. But it's essentially a disease that's been wiped off the planet.
But of course, there's other diseases that are out there and doing terrible things. Imagine if we could only have had a COVID vaccine that was a sugar cube. We'd be living in a different world today.
It is a remarkable story, and I think we're forgetting how remarkable it was. If we pull ourselves back 5 years, now January 2020, just hearing about the outbreak in China, not knowing what this disease was, not knowing how it would be treated, not knowing how long stores would be shut down and we'd be out of toilet paper. It was very frightening. Okay? Let me just go through the timeline, starting with these 2 people. No, back. Let's go with it. Yeah, let's start with these 2 people. This is Drew Wiseman and Caitlin Carrico. They were rightly given the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 2023 because they developed what was called the mRNA vaccine. This was a platform based on a small genetic particle that could get into your cells and deliver an antidote. There were lots of potential clues for how to make a vaccine, but this was the one that enabled a safe form of the vaccine to get quickly into your cells and do its business. Now, they did their work in the 1990s and the 2000s, and they continued to work together. Unfortunately, they worked at University of Pennsylvania. Both of them were colleagues. University of Pennsylvania let go Caitlin in 1995. They didn't think her work was fashionable enough. They changed their tune in 2023 when she got the Nobel Prize. So if we go to the timeline, so we heard about the outbreak from Wuhan in December, okay? One of, again, things that will be noted for the success of getting the vaccine done so quickly was the fact that China shared the genetic map of this virus with the whole world. And in January of 2020, it was put on what's called the Gen Bank of NIH, and that basically is shared with every virologist around the world. And at that same time, NIH starts putting a lot of money into developing a vaccine, hundreds of millions of dollars. And two companies here in the West, Moderna and Pfizer, started gearing up. There were others, of course. And remarkably, 2 months later, clinical trials began with the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. I've given you a little history of some of the other vaccines. Some of them took 10, 20 years to develop. Here we have a vaccine being developed in a month. It's part of the problem with vaccine hesitancy. Some folks think the process was rushed. But the NIH protocols for clinical trials were all filled, including the important phase 3, where you have a large clinical trial set, and you share that data of the effectiveness and the safety. All of that was done, and by November and December, FDA grants authorization for both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, and then we're all rushing out to get the vaccine. It's an amazing story, and it caused us to recover from this scourge, but it also caused some other problems. And I think I mentioned why it happened so quickly, mainly because there was already 30 years of work done on the mRNA vaccines, but also because of the global crisis. There was urgency across the entire globe, and there was a lot of money thrown at it. So here is the bottom line, that by March of 2022, 2 years after the breakout, our use of COVID-19 vaccines in this country prevented 2 million deaths, 17 million hospitalizations, and 66 million infections. And it saved this country about a $1 trillion healthcare bill. You take in those two statements, and then you hear what our present Secretary of Health and Human Services did on August 5th, when he cancels $500 million of research on the mRNA vaccine model. The original work was done a few years ago, but this model seems to be very effective for all sorts of other diseases, and it might lead us to a flu vaccine that doesn't have to be modified every year. But that work has been stopped by our present administration. Because of all of that angst, I don't think anybody in this room paid for a COVID vaccine, right? And that was true for most of the vaccines I talked about, because it was a realization of the government that if we vaccinated people, they could live, go to work, and pay taxes. And it's cheaper to pay for it up front than afterwards. So let's end with a little bit of what's going on now. You probably have seen some of the articles in the paper. Here's one from the Washington Post on December 31st. And data from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. If you actually want to get health data that you trust, go there. go to Johns Hopkins or go to Harvard Medical public sites. The blue line are the measles cases. This is a disease that was essentially wiped out. And here it is coming back. I think the next slide shows, can I have the next slide? Oh, yeah. Next slide shows where the epicenters are. You can probably guess. You see those big blue spots. There's the South Carolina epicenter. There's the Texas epicenter. These are people that feel that they don't need vaccines. Unfortunately, the people making decisions are not the children who will be most hurt with measles. You see the red dots there. Some of these people travel through airports. And measles is one of the most infectious diseases known to man. So be careful. And I'm going to end with this slide. This basically shows the red lines are the annual number of people that were killed, averaged over the 20th century, by these diseases. Measles on top because it's so infectious. Then pertussis, mumps, rubella, okay, all childhood vaccinations. Then smallpox, diphtheria, and polio, we don't even think about that anymore. And in the orange line, it shows the number of cases. And basically, vaccines wiped these diseases away from our worry until this latest round of hesitancy. So I end with this quote from the World Health Organization: vaccines have saved more lives than any other medical invention in history. World Health Association.
And that was a victory for vaccines, and we will be happy to take any of your questions now. Thank you. Wait for the microphone. We're going to bring the microphone over so you can ask the questions, and so the people at home can hear it.
Actually, I'm going to ask one question that came in online. How did FDR contract polio?
It's not exactly sure, but the back timing it from when his symptoms arrived to what he had been doing. He was at a Boy Scout jamboree at a Boy Scout camp on the Hudson Valley, and he went swimming. And science now thinks that a lot of the transmission of polio came through exposure to fecal material in water, and that he probably contracted it there, and then went up to Campobello, and the symptoms arrived. I think it was 10 days later. So that's the best we know, but it's hard to pinpoint it exactly. I think
if you looked at historical data on the outbreaks of polio, they typically started in June and leveled off in September, and they timed with kids going into swimming pools and mud puddles. So.
Okay.
Who was on the dime?
The Winged
Roosevelt?
Mercury. Winged Mercury was the design, and what was the one before that? The veiled. But the Winged Mercury was one of the earlier dimes, and then there were a couple. There was one called the Veiled Justice, I think, was the one right before him. And of course, in the old days, the dimes were silver. But the controversy around putting him on the dime itself in 1946, there was a political battle. Of course, there's always a political battle, but it was so overwhelmingly supported that it passed Congress with a huge majority. So it wasn't until the 90s that it became another controversy again. We have someone over here.
So what is the status of vaccinations today for those in the military? Do you know?
You mean the legal status?
No. Are those people serving in the military required to get vaccinations? Are they vaccinated? Yes. And that continues despite Mr. Kennedy?
To the best of my knowledge, the military vaccinations, the military have a much broader spectrum of vaccinations that they're required to get, particularly those who are traveling overseas or are going to be based in third world countries. I don't have the actual list. There was a great deal of controversy because a number of active duty servicemen during COVID who refused the COVID vaccine were discharged. And I believe there were some legal cases that were brought to try to have them reinstated. I don't know the status of them at this point. But the military understands that you can't have, an epidemic swiping through your troops who live in close proximity. Particularly, the Navy was always deeply concerned about this because of the close quarters.
Great program, guys. Thanks. Our oldest son has worked in vaccine research for the last 8 years or so. And
NIH funded, I presume?
yeah. And some of that's been pulled. However, it's good to know he is deep into Lyme disease vaccine, a new malaria, dengue fever, and there's one other one that I can't remember. We can't have conversations with him because we don't understand them. But I guess my question is, he has lost a couple different contracts. He was working on mRNA with Pfizer and Moderna for a while. And do you have any thoughts on our private companies stepping up in the vacuum here, or because he's still really busy, but obviously they're very nervous about this?
Look, I don't have any insights on this other than to repeat the terrible things that happened in the very beginning of this current administration when they threatened a 40% cutback in NIH staff, and then cut back a lot of clinical studies when they were at their stage 3. And some of that was reinstated. They didn't do all the staff cuts. They put back some of the contracts. But science is not something that you can turn on and off with a spigot. Some of the damage that occurred the first few months of the administration will take a decade to repair. And whether, pharmaceutical companies tend to step up where they see a short-term profit, okay? Look, it's very expensive to develop a new drug. Some estimates are in the $50 million range.
Actually, my brother who worked in pharmaceuticals for a number of years, the average cost to get a drug to market is $1 billion.
Yeah.
So, and
you need someone to start that off.
What has happened, in the mid 20th century, the pharmaceutical companies were developing one blockbuster drug after another, for hypertension, for cholesterol, and they were both very profitable, but they also created great competition between the big pharmaceutical companies, Merck and Pfizer, these companies. By the 21st century, the pharmaceutical companies actually sort of shut down their research facilities. And what they started doing was looking at the startup companies, which would operate much lower cost, and they would see them developing a promising drug, and then the big company would go in and buy it and essentially become a marketing firm for drugs that were being developed by these startup companies. So they don't have, like Merck, one of the great pharmaceutical companies, in the history of the world, all of their research facilities in New Jersey are gone. The few areas that they're still doing research are in other countries, primarily India, which is also that they've outsourced a lot of the manufacturing of their medicines. So, we can't look to private industry to invest the kind of money that's necessary, which is why the federal government sort of became the primary funder and developer for these vaccines. I see a question over there. Oh, one over here and then over there.
I want you to see I'm history. I'm an old nurse. Took care of every one of those but smallpox. I trained in New Orleans in the 50s. These hands have been put inside an iron lung because they were children. I saw everything, and my worry today is I am seeing everything come back that I saw wiped out. If you ever had a child brought into you dying of perniosis, of whooping cough, I never wanted to see that again. I saw kids die of just about everything because we had a I trained at Charity in New Orleans, which is the big hospital that is standing there. We had a 4-story building of just communicable disease. We're subtropical. It was real moist and everything. And I, at nearly 88, never wanted to see any of this. The history that I have seen of vaccines, it was wonderful. I couldn't believe the COVID. I was so scared when COVID came up. And I gave both the Sabin and the Salk vaccine. So my worry today is why, with all the media we have and everything, our history of that period, especially lockjaw, which is, you know, you don't ever want to see that. And people are not getting the tetanus anymore. Mumps. We still don't have a vaccine for TB, and we still don't have one for leprosy. We had a leprosy colony when I was in nurses training in Carville, Louisiana. And if you ever had to serve at any of these places, a TB vaccine we don't have. I took TB in northern Alabama and Tennessee because it was out on a hospital hill. So just wanted to say, encourage everybody. You know what? Any of you on the media, I wish you would just, if you ever lived through some of this history, talk about it. I think that's what has to be done. And thank you. It was wonderful.
No, I agree with you totally. Thank you. And I think part of the problems is, you know, because we cured these diseases 50, 60 years ago, that you don't have the living memory with parents having seen their older siblings or their aunts and uncles die from these terrible diseases. And so they think they're safe. They think, well, my child doesn't have to be vaccinated. You know, other kids can be vaccinated, not understanding this concept of herd immunity, that really you need to have as many people as possible. And I think people like you who have stories to tell, it's vitally important that we get those stories out, because people today don't understand the horrors of what these diseases were.
For measles, the herd immunity level is about 95%. And the worry is we might drop below that. Those of you who had your measles vaccines long ago, next time you go see your MD, ask him or her that you might want to get a renewal because it has sort of a 10-year latency. If there's no measles around, you don't need it, but that's not the situation.
And if measles reappears in this country, most developed countries in the world will prevent Americans from traveling to their countries. It's that serious. If we drop to 95 or 90%, then the other countries will start blocking Americans from coming in without a certificate. Okay, we have one there and then one over there. Over there.
We got 3? Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right.
As a retired nurse who has worked both in nursing, in hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing homes, etc., and then worked the last half of my career in clinical research, conducting clinical trials in ALS long before they now are beginning to show some results. But I worked on ALS trials in the 90s, and I've worked on HIV trials and other areas of medicine. I think, and also growing up in the 50s, I was one of the first to receive the Salk vaccine in 1953. I also remember my older brother coming home from an overnight camp in, would have been 51 or 52, and having, he had to come home because 2 boys at the camp contracted polio. One I know died. And we were on quarantine. The Board of Health came and posted on the door that we were quarantined. We missed the first few weeks of school. But today's society doesn't understand, not only do they not understand about the necessity of herd immunity via vaccine, but they don't realize when they talk about freedoms, they don't recognize, because the Board of Health does not have to quarantine routinely anymore. They don't understand this. So public education really needs a lot of work.
Yeah,
Thank you for your service. I would urge all of you, if you want to learn a little more about polio, Your local PBS channel that still exists has two wonderful shows on polio through the American Experience program. They were done about 10 years ago, but they're still very good.
No, I just wanted to say I recently retired as a research biochemist for one of the large pharma companies that you mentioned. And we are devastated to have lost so many of our NIH colleagues. But we are no longer, we stopped farming out research because we found that what we were farming out to other countries was not good research coming back to us. So now we're doing it all on site.
Oh, that's a good development.
Yeah. And, one of the last things I worked on was erecting a building for, to get these things out the door at a fast rate. So
it was one of the big issues around quality control when we started exporting the manufacture
Yes.
of these vaccines
Yes.
and the manufacture of, especially the ones that require very, very high levels of scientific
Yeah.
purity.
We found it with small molecules as well as our biologics. So we're just bringing it all back home.
Some of you may remember when the Salk vaccine went out for its first year, there was a collection of doses made in Nevada by Carter Pharmaceuticals that had a live vaccine in it, and it killed 300 kids. And so it stopped the polio vaccination efforts in its track until that could be identified, and then proper QA procedures were in place. But look how quickly it was developed and put out there. It was not surprising that there wasn't a mistake like that.
One of the things that people don't fully appreciate today is that the infant mortality rate, in the 19th century was 40%, because these diseases were so deadly. And so we live in a society now in which good health is almost taken for granted. We're still struggling with issues like cancer and dementia and ALS, malaria still in some countries, but I think we have lost our fear of the disease because we feel like we've won that battle. But the truth is the battle is only won if we continue on the course we've been on. We've gone a little bit over our time. I just want to say thank you all for coming. Thank you, Fred. A round of applause for Fred, please.
And to our host, Paul.
My next program will be in February. It'll be about the Yalta conference, where 3 countries just decided how they're going to divide up the world. It's not particularly topical today, but it should be a good talk. And anyway, thank you all very much, and go Niners!